Trooper Garino, did you have an opportunity to obtain phone calls, voice messages, and text messages from the defendant to Mr. O'Keefe's phone on the evening of January 29th, 2022?
Yes, I was.
Where did you get the phone call records from?
From John O'Keefe's phone.
Where did you get the voicemails from?
Also from John O'Keefe's phone.
Where did you get the text messages from?
From John O'Keefe's phone.
Did you have an opportunity to take those phone calls, the voice messages, and the text messages and put them in a chronological order?
Yes, I did.
Did you include all of the phone calls, all the text messages, and all of the voicemails?
Between John O'Keefe and the defendant, yes.
Did you create a PowerPoint to put them in a chronological order?
Yes. So these are the phone calls on the 29th. So at 12:35 a.m., the defendant calls John. That phone call is not answered. 12:34:09 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:34:38 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:35:09 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 12:35:35, the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:36:09 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered.
Trooper Garino, let me stop you there for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Did you look into any internet connection between the defendant's phone and the router and the internet connection at Meadows Ave, John O'Keefe's home that night?
Yes. At 12:36:39 a.m., the defendant's phone auto connects to the Wi-Fi HATSFAM 123.
Are you familiar with the router at Mr. O'Keefe's home?
I have not done a look at it in person, but that's the known network that's listed under it. There's two, HATSFAM 123 and O'Keefe 74.
Did you learn the range that a connection must be in order to connect to his router?
Yes, so depending on the router, it's either a 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz radio band, or signal band, I should say. Depending on which one it's connecting to, which band, it's either 150-foot indoor range or up to 300 feet outdoor. So, again, when you pull into your home, sometimes you can still be connected to your home Wi-Fi in the driveway.
And again, can you give us the time of the connection between the defendant's phone and Mr. O'Keefe's router at Meadows Ave that night?
Yes, 12:36:39 a.m.
Please continue.
At 12:36:40 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. At 12:37:08 a.m., the defendant calls John, and voicemail number 1 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman, would you kindly play the voicemail for 12:37:08? At 12:38:26 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:39:03 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:39:37 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:40:43 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. At 12:41:35 a.m., the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 2 is left. Some beeping noises, appears to be a butt dial or accidental call. Ms. Gilman, could you play the voice message at 12:41:35?
The defendant then texts John O'Keefe at 12:55:31 a.m. on the 29th, "I'm going home." The defendant texts John O'Keefe See you later at 12:55:50 a.m. on the 29th. At 12:58:19 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:58:47 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:59:24 a.m., the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 3 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman.
John, I'm here with your fucking kids. Nobody knows what the fuck you want, you fucking pervert.
At 1 a.m. 26 seconds, the defendant calls John. It's not answered. At 1 a.m. 49 seconds, the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 4 is left. It's 1 second called, no sound.
Ms. Gilman.
That was it. The defendant texts John O'Keefe, your kids are cucking alone at 1:02 a.m. on the 29th. The defendant texts John O'Keefe, I'm back in Mansfield, the kids are home alone, 1:04:14 a.m. on the 29th. At 1:10:17 a.m., the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 5 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman.
Yeah, it's 1 in the morning. I'm with your fucking niece and nephew. You fucking pervert. You're a fucking pervert.
At 1:10:44 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. At 1:12:18 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 1:12:46 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 1:13:13 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. At 1:14:11 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 1:14:44 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 1:16:10 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 1:16:38 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. At 1:17:37 a.m., the defendant calls John. So when voicemail 6 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman.
John, I'm going home. I cannot babysit your niece. I need to go home. You are fucking using me right now. You're fucking another girl. Kim's sleeping next to me. You're a fucking loser. Fuck yourself.
At 1:18:38 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. At 4:38:14 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:38:49 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:39:39 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:40:05 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:42:05 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:42:54 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:45:10 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:04:27 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:21:28 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:21:58 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:23:26 a.m., the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 7 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman.
John, I'm going to die.
At 5:24:27 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:25:28 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:26:14 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:28:16 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:28:43 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:29:21 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:29:46 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:30:15 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:30:52 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:31:21 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:36:29 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 6:03:02 a.m., the defendant calls John, and voicemail number 8 is left with some voice and noise and background.
Ms. Gilman, could you play that, please?
Yes, I need someone to take over for you. 34 beautiful Vietnam with a handcuff notice no. Yeah. Okay, I know. Where's the blankets? I don't see blankets, Terry. Yes, I need
We have the lights on, please. I have no further questions.
All right. Mr. Alessi, does this seem like a good time to take the luncheon recess?
Yes, Your Honor.